With a bite force of around 1,160 psi, enough to crush a bowling ball, and a top running speed of 35 to 40 miles per hour, grizzly bears are terrifyingly effective predators, who even today provoke primal fear into those they cross paths with. You are much less likely to run into one of these modern-day monsters today compared to the people living in North America in the 1800s. This is the historic range of the grizzly bear, but due to deliberate hunting and habitat loss, that range has been dramatically reduced. But we still have stories from a time when running into a grizzly bear was something to be worried about every day. Today's video will be made up of first-hand encounters with grizzly bears in the Old West, with the stories coming from the books Cowboys, Mountain Men, and Grizzly Bears by Matthew P. Mayo and Undaunted Courage by Stephen E. Ambrose. While traveling along the Missouri River, the men of the Lewis and Clark expedition encountered many people, places, and animals that were entirely new to European Americans. None of the men had ever come into contact with the grizzly bear before, but they had continually heard stories of these ferocious beasts from the various native tribes they interacted with. They were nervous and excited to eventually take on the bear. In a quote from Undaunted Courage, "It gave him a bit of pause that the Indians, before attacking a grizzly, went through all the rituals they commonly used before going on a war party. Still, he, Clark, and the men had faith in their long rifles and were eager to challenge the grizzly." However confident the men were, they had quite a few close calls with the bears. In his first encounter, Meriwether Lewis and another man were walking by the river and saw two grizzlies. They each fired and hit both bears. One bear ran off, but the second bear charged and chased the men for 80 yards. Luckily, they had wounded it enough to slow it down, and they were able to reload and kill the bear. A week later, a group of men from the expedition killed another bear, but only after putting 5 bullets into its lungs and 5 more into other parts of the bear. Even then, it took 20 minutes to finally die. The men were gaining respect for the powerful animal. Just 9 days later, the men had a very close call. The 6 men in the rear canoes saw a grizzly on the shore and decided to ambush it. The men snuck up to within 40 yards of the bear when 4 men fired their rifles, with the other 2 saving their bullets. All 4 balls hit the bear, with 2 passing through the lungs. The bear immediately charged the men. The 2 men with loaded guns fired, with 1 hitting muscle and 1 breaking the charging bear's shoulder, which barely slowed it. The men ran, with 2 getting away in canoes and the other 4 hiding in the bushes, where they reloaded and fired again. This only told the bear where they were, and it charged the men again. It was closing on 2 of the men, who ditched their rifles and dove into the river. The bear jumped in after them and was just about to reach one of the swimmers, when a man who was still on the bank finally shot the bear through the head, killing it. The bear had been shot 8 times. In another quote from Undaunted Courage, Meriwether Lewis says, "These bears, being so hard to die, rather intimidates us all. I must confess that I do not like the gentleman, and had rather fight 2 Indians than 1 bear." The next story comes from Cowboys, Mountain Men, and Grizzly Bears, and it's not for the faint of heart. In 1824, just 18 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition, legendary mountain man Jedediah Smith was leading a group of free trappers along the Cheyenne River. They were only about a mile away from where they had planned to camp when all of a sudden, with no warning, a massive grizzly bear ran out of the trees straight for the head of the column, led by Jed Smith. Before anyone could react, the bear had grabbed Smith by the head and pulled him off his horse. The rest of the men pulled their rifles, but with the bear actively mauling Smith, they couldn't get a clean shot off. Second in command, Jim Kleiman, yelled, quote, "Don't shoot the captain," and charged the bear, yelling and waving his arms. The other men followed, and now much closer began to shoot the bear, eventually killing it. 2 men were sent to find the horses who had ran off, while the rest of them gathered around Jed Smith. His scalp had been peeled back and hung from his head. His left eyebrow had been ripped off, and his left ear was barely hanging on. His chest and belly were slashed, and he had multiple broken ribs. Somehow he was still conscious, and he said to his men, quote, "2 men get to the river, bring water. Help me sit up now, and someone get my spare shirt to stop the blood flow." Now leaning against the dead bear, Smith told Jim Kleiman that he would have to stitch his scalp back to his head. Kleiman was hesitant, but Smith said, quote, "You're the one for it, Jim." The men offered Jed Smith some whiskey for the pain, but Smith, who famously didn't drink alcohol, refused, and instead the men brought him his Bible. They sent a few men ahead to go set up camp. Kleiman picked twigs and grass from the scalp of Jedediah and prepared for the operation, saying, quote, "Boys, get prepared to hold them down. This is going to hurt like the devil himself is doing it." To which Smith replied, "Can't be any worse than what has already befallen me, Jim. Now get on." It took around an hour to reattach the scalp, and Jedediah Smith barely moved or made a sound during it. Kleiman said that there was no hope for the ear, but Jed Smith ordered him to sew it back too. After the ear was stitched on, the men helped their captain to the camp. They stayed there for only 10 days while Jed Smith healed. He then told his men that it was time to continue west. This is just one of the remarkable events in Jedediah Smith's life, who would go on to wear his hair long to cover his brutal grizzly bear scars. The next story is also from Cowboys, Mountain Men, and Grizzly Bears. In the early 1860s, near Pony, Montana, near a small quartz mine, one of the older miners named M.D. Hathaway headed into the forest with a shotgun, hoping to shoot some birds for dinner. Just after entering a thicket, he saw a grouse. He took aim and fired. He hit the bird, but it fell down a small nearby hill. He loaded another shell and took off after the bird. Running down the hill, he nearly ran right into a large cinnamon-colored grizzly bear, who was investigating the grouse he had just shot. The bear looked at him and immediately charged. MD had just enough time to shoot his birdshot into the bear. The bear stopped for just a moment, and MD turned around and was running up the gravel hill. But in his panic, he slipped and slid backwards. Then the bear was on him. It swatted him in the ribcage and knocked him down. He was able to kick the bear in the face, but it only made it angrier. It bit down on his arm, snapping his bones, and began to shake him like a rag doll. He punched the bear in the eyes with his left arm, and it let go of his right arm and bit down on his left, while clawing at his chest with its massive paws. MD blacked out, and when he woke, he was back in the mining camp. The other men had found him and were nursing him back to health. They had also tracked and killed the bear that had attacked him. During the confusion of finding Hathaway and tracking the bear, somehow it was reported that MD had been killed and was recorded and reported in the paper. MD Hathaway spent the rest of his life walking around with a copy of his own death notice in his pocket.